British media before the mandate. Let's get to the first slide here. In 1901, Theodor Herzl, father of modern Zionism, published his utopian novel Alt-Neuland, The Old New Land. In it, he laid out an idealized utopian version of Zionist settlement in Palestine, featuring free farmers and agricultural cooperatives. This is what Herzl hoped for, a self-sustaining settlement of rural Jewry in the Old New Land. Herzl insisted that the real advantage of settling in Palestine was that it was primitive and neglected. Yet, even in his own work, Herzl acknowledged the people who had already been cultivating the land, with orange groves becoming both the paradox of the barren land myth and an example of Zionist ingenuity over Arab primitiveness. In a chapter titled Prosperous Land, Herzl writes an exchange between a Zionist settler named Steinek and Rashid Bey, an Arab Jaffa orange grower, in which Steinek tries to give credit of the prosperous orange industry to the Zionist settlers. While Rashid Bey corrects him, reminding him that orange cultivation began long before European immigration, he concedes that everything here has increased in value since your immigration, and how advantageous it was to be part of the new society. In Herzl's mind, even the Arabs would benefit from Zionist settlement. I'm going to stop there just for a second and let you know where the area that we're talking about is. So this is a map taken out of the Thomas Cook Guide in 1891. This little insert right here is of Palestine during this time, and it included part of what is now Jordan. But this kind of gives you context to where this is. And in this context, when I'm talking about Palestinian agriculture, I'm not talking about modern day Palestine or Palestinian agriculture. What I'm talking about is the agriculture that was conducted in this area here. Prior to the mandate, prior to the mandate, maps of the area kind of termed Palestine in a very vague way. So this isn't defined lines. This is an area that the British and Europeans tended to refer to as Palestine as well as others. The mandate itself lasted from 1923 to 1948, and it granted the United Kingdom administering power over Palestine. However, this paper will only examine pre-mandate representation, so from about the mid-19th century until 1922. Sven Heiden's book, Jerusalem in 1918, gives, I think, a very good definition of what Zionism is during this time. And I would prefer to use a definition that I think they would more closely associate with, and that is the struggle of Judaism against annihilation, and its object is the building up of a genuinely Jewish population in Palestine with agriculture as its economic basis and Hebrew as its vernacular. I think that is, for this time period, a very accurate version of what Zionism felt it was. But before we get started, what is important to note very early on is that what is missing from British media reports in the discussion of Palestinian agriculture, especially orange cultivation, is the Arab population. They are seen as less as cultivators and more as relics, often fitting into the background or taking up a role of agitator. Discussions of the landscape are often void of those doing the majority of the labor. This does not change much during the war. A 1916 book review in the Yorkshire Post is quite revealing in this respect. The reviewer attributes the increase in Jaffa's trade almost entirely to the Jewish colonies, the Arabs being, by comparison, backward in their methods and apparently content to take service under the Jews. The idea that the Arab population would be grateful for European ingenuity being brought to Palestine is an essential part of the barren land mythos, as is the erasure of the perceived indigenous population from the literal fruits of their labor. This picture is actually from 1926. It's by an early Israeli artist named Gutman, and I think it does a pretty good job of kind of representing that viewpoint. They were not actually seen as more cultivators, more as almost a lazy part of the labor movement. So I wanted to give you guys kind of a visual representation of that. This idea that Jewish immigration to Palestine would reinvigorate a perceived desolate, antiquated land extended beyond Herzl. The barren land myth is a belief that the territory of what was then Palestine was uncultivated or undercultivated. That could only be brought back by to its biblical glory by Jewish settlement. It is a myth that has existed throughout the 20th century, and in the works of political thinkers such as Hannah Arendt, who wrote in 1942, "The right of the Jewish people in Palestine is the same right every human being has to the fruits of his work. That the Arabs had 1,500 years to turn a stony desert into a fertile land, whereas the Jews had not even 40, and the difference is quite remarkable." This myth was so successful that it still exists as a dominant part of the Israeli national mythology. In 2015, for example, Vogue Italia covered the Israeli exhibit Fields of Tomorrow, in which they described it as an exhibit that recounts the great works of reforestation that has transformed semi-dry territories into sustainable farming. And in August 2000, the Irish Independent reminisced that one of the only things people knew about Israel in its early years was Jaffa oranges and grapefruit, two examples of Zionist agricultural prosperity. This myth is also integral to the legitimization of both British land policy under the Mandate and its support for Zionism, which we will touch on later. But throughout the 19th century and into the 20th, the barren land myth dominated British ideas of contemporary Palestine. Religious pilgrims, journalists, and other visitors write of a stony desert or semi-dry territories. A British geography textbook from 1802 describes the agriculture as in the most deplorable condition, and the instruments and management appalling. Western travelers during this time were heavily influenced by Christian tradition and their Western surroundings into seeing Palestine as terribly desolate, a country without a people, not representing the reality of the land. As others have noted before me, we should be cautious in taking British, or more generally European, observations at face value. There was a tendency to romanticize Palestine and view it through the lens of Western Christianity, a subset of Orientalism Lorenzo Camel terms biblical Orientalism. Indeed, the idea of Palestine being a stony desert is challenged by the descriptions of Jaffa and its orange groves at the time. In 1883 and 1886, we have two separate examples of this. Several British newspapers covered the lecture tours of two different British pilgrims to Palestine. The first, Reverend James Neal, spoke of Jaffa, or the Beautiful, it being so named on account of the glorious orange groves extending miles around it. The second was George Macomb, evoking a Jaffa surrounded by orange groves, with about 8 million oranges being exported annually. The same descriptions continue into the 1900s, whether it be the mayor of South Molton writing into the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette about the city of Jaffa, glistening white like a jewel under the burning sun, set in its verdant oasis of brilliant green, the orange trees for which it is famous extending for miles in every direction. Or an account in the Dairy Journal in 1909 describing Jaffa oranges as the size of sugar melons, thin of skin, seedless, and deliciously sweet and juicy. Jaffa oranges were what many people knew about Palestine beyond scripture. According to the Daily Telegraph, London in 1909, English people have the word Jaffa so firmly imprinted on their memories that to them, the orange of Palestine represents the choicest. Or the gushing description of Palestinian oranges given by a banker, that's what he's titled in the byline, in his religious tinted 1906 piece, The Harvest of the Earth. Then there is the golden harvest of the magnificent orange gardens of Palestine and elsewhere, the former probably by far the finest in the world, each lofty tree a glowing harmony of gold and green, loaded with a wild profusion of great oval fruit, thrice the size of any ordinary orange. It wasn't just any old orange. You could almost say it held the status what might equate to the Haas avocados among millennials today, if only the avocado was equated with the Holy Land and not Hollywood. And it wasn't just newspapers that devoted words to the orange groves in Palestine. Cook's Tour's Handbook of Palestine and Syria from 1891 makes mention of orange groves no less than 6 times. But perhaps unsurprisingly, it mentions Jews or Israel over 60. On page 135, it even laments that one thinks the devout Jews in every land as they pray for the restoration of their land. In 1858, the Caledonian Mercury covered a lecture given by the Reverend Hidley Chaim Herschel, a Polish-born Jew who converted to evangelical Christianity and believed in the restoration of Israel by the Jews. Whereas the good Reverend not only pointed out the present desolate conditions of Palestine, that was becoming rapidly depopulated, but relayed his plea with the Ottoman Sultan to proclaim liberty to all Jews throughout the world to return to their land, In this way, they might restore and repopulate the land. This, just wanted to give you an idea of what early Zionist agriculture kind of looked like. These are two different examples. This one's from 1892. There's a packing house that would have been part of an agricultural school. And this is just planting oranges in Petah Tikva in 1906. But biblical Orientalism and Christian Zionism were simply one part of a much wider picture. The end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th also saw an influx of Eastern European Jews to Western European countries and the United States due to Russian pogroms. The press prior to the First World War saw three types of Jews: English Jews, foreign Jews, and Jewish settlers in Palestine. While foreign Jews in Britain were often seen by the press as competition, a rabble, or as criminals and cheats, Zionist settlers in Palestine were seen predominantly either as persecuted or causing excitement among the Muslim population, or more often than not, as making a return to the land and as industrial. One must question whether the Jew returning to his rightful homeland was, for some, an important, if not subtle, way of diverting immigration, of creating a more English England. In May 1905, during the debate surrounding the Aliens Act, Balfour argued that the British have the right to keep out everybody who does not add to the strength of the community, the industrial, social, and intellectual strength of the community. According to Bernard Gaynor, immigrant and Jew became synonymous terms because of the extraordinary concern for the social problems of the East End of London, which emerged roughly at the same time as the first great wave of immigration. Slogans such as "England for the English" accompanied "Go back to Jerusalem," appearing on the streets and in the papers. There is a popular assertion that the press would appear to have been almost uniformly hostile to the Zionist project during the pre-mandate and mandate period. And I've heard this from non-academics as well whenever I mention my thesis. It's a very popular myth. Anthony Julius points out specifically to the Morning Post and the Times as prime examples. Yet the Morning Post is a newspaper previously quoted as positive towards Zionist agriculture during this time. In 1907, it even made the connection between Russian refugees and immigration to Palestine with a small piece entitled "Progress Made in Palestine," about the conflict within Jewish circles in regard to the potential for Jewish colonization in response to the Russian refugee problem. And within the piece, seemed to agree that with the influx of refugees, the new Jewish colonization of Palestine is making the most satisfactory of progress, noting new industry and an increase in population, as well as great success with the export of oranges and other agricultural produce. None of this is to suggest that the press, before or during the mandate, was universally supportive of Zionism. Rather, there is no uniform opinion on Zionism, much in the same way that there was not uniform opinion in Parliament or within the Jewish community in Britain. The threat of Bolshevism mixed with entrenched anti-Semitism, and by the start of the mandate, there was a very real fear coming from the press. The Times described Jews in Palestine as pushful, grasping, and domineering, and ran a May 1920 article on the Jewish peril, Protocol of the Learned Elders of Zion, which made reference to Jewish world government in Moscow, among other conspiracy theories of world domination. The Morning Post may have put early Zionist agricultural efforts in supportive light, but that did not stop it from following the Times' lead and running the most notorious 1920 series, The Cause of World Unrest, also used the conspiracy theory, the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, to account for the rise of Bolshevism in Russia. It's just an advertisement in the Globe for that particular series, and it then became a book, unfortunately. This is the way they advertised it. It's this little bit right here. But there were also papers who famously were pro-Zionist, such as The Guardian, and others who ran a mix of articles that one day might appear to be praising the nationalist movement and the next critiquing it. It is in the discussion of agriculture that we see some of the strongest support for Zionism continue to blossom, as well as a new representation of Jewish masculinity. During the war, the British government used Zionism and Arab nationalism to highlight Ottoman administrative inadequacies and corruption. In doing so, it helped to further entrench the idea of Zionist settlers into the landscape of Palestine in two critical ways: by making them victims of Ottoman atrocity, and by creating the image of the able Zionist settler taking up arms alongside the British. The press at the time, at the start of the war, reported on the uncertainty felt by settlers, with several papers reporting on the English Zionist organization's concern in regard to the fate of the Jewish colonies in Palestine, while enumerating their many agricultural accomplishments, including 40 agricultural colonies, agricultural schools, and training farms. These fears would be realized in 1917 with the evacuation of Jaffa. The Jewish Chronicle was quoted in papers across the country as reporting, "Tel Aviv, the beautiful garden city suburb of Jaffa, has been sacked and lies mere heaps of ruins, while similar wanton destruction has in all probability taken place in other specifically Jewish parts of Palestine, the colonies not being spared. But worse is threatened, for the Turkish governor, Jamal Pasha, has proclaimed the intention of the authorities to wipe out mercilessly the Jewish population of Palestine, his public statement being that the Armenian policy of massacre is to be applied to the Jews." Similar stories would run through 1917 and lingered through to the Mandate. The Iraqi has been called into question by Yuval Ben Basset, who compared what happened in Jaffa to the evacuation of Gaza in the same year. They come to the conclusion that the evacuations were conducted due to military considerations rather than by political motivations, such as the desire to destroy Zionism or Arab nationalism, which is questionable, but referring to pieces like the above as false rumors. However, at the time, these reports, whether true or not, would have garnered sympathy, especially if the comparison to the Armenians was taken at face value. It was one of the main ways that the British tried to get the Americans into the war. The Armenian massacres were a huge part of their propaganda campaign. Further, it should be noted that while complaints of an almost favoritism shown to the Arab inhabitants, which would possibly be laughable to most Arabs considering Jamal Pasha's reputation even to today, he admitted to allowing those who have sown summer crops to remain, along with all the factory owners and the workers, which is all the manufacturing power, to tend the fields and factories based on agricultural production. This is possibly a way that we can see the difference between the way the British media sees them, sees the main labor in Palestine versus the way that the British media sees the labor in Palestine. So Ottoman versus British media. The truth of these claims is questionable, but if true, could show who the Ottomans perceived as the main working force in comparison to the British press and the Zionist organization. 1917 was also the year the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, a declaration of support for Zionism, or Jewish nationalism, and the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the world's Jewry. The response to this was celebratory among Zionists, but received mixed reaction elsewhere, including from the Catholic Church, who voiced concern for the non-Jewish Arab inhabitants of Palestine. And a month after the Balfour Declaration was announced, Allenby entered Jerusalem, and the British took Jaffa, effectively starting the occupation of the territory. Recruitment started shortly after this, and this is where we start to see the way in which agricultural colonies reshaped how Jews in Palestine were perceived. The Times quoted Zionist leaders in August of 1918 as saying, "We know that by carrying out our peacetime work on the land, we could help the prosecution of the war. But at this historic moment, we cannot stick to this role only. We volunteers are mostly laborers working plow to pick. In work on the soil, we see the leaven of our national renaissance. If we now leave our work, it is because an inner voice calls to us to give not only the sweat of our brow, but our blood also." A few sentences later in the same article, they write, "The scene in Jaffa particularly recalled the scenes in England in 1914. Agricultural colonies did not just offer the opportunity to reclaim the land, they became a way to reimagine who the European Jew was. In a way, it Europeanized Jews in a way they may not have in their countries of origin. It was a spontaneous movement of a number of young Jewish colonists, mostly of Russian origin, who felt it was their duty to bear their share in the task of liberating their homes from the hated Turk," read an August 1918 article in the Western Daily Press. And went further, comparing the Jaffa Jew's physique to that of the Jerusalem Jew. The former's physique is remarkable, whereas the latter had 1/3 of their applicants being rejected. This was not something that started in 1918, simply something that was more pronounced with the reports on recruitment. If we look back at the 1916 Yorkshire Post book review that I mentioned earlier, it quotes Lieutenant Colonel Patterson as saying, "The young Jews have plenty of grit in them." High praise from military command. And in 1917, the Daily Record of Glasgow denounced the skeptics who asked, "Are the Jews fitted to take up this life? And are they willing to undergo the hard toil of the pioneer in a land long robbed of its pristine fertility by centuries of neglect?" The answer for them was an unqualified affirmative, and the point for proof to what they have already accomplished in Palestine. In Palestine, the Daily Record writes, "The Jews lead the healthy, vigorous life of the farmer, producing grapes, wine, oranges, etc." And the article following claimed that throughout the war, Jews have shed their blood freely for the rights of small nationalities, concluding that democracy of the Anglo-Saxon race should open wide the gates of Palestine to the Jews. Apologies. A few months later, in August 1917, the Daily Record printed a picture of Jewish soldiers outside of a Scottish synagogue in connection with the raising of the Jewish regiments. And I think this offers an insight into how even Jews at home were starting to be perceived differently. This is not the weak physique of the Jew that you often find in 19th century media reports or in scientific journals or in stereotypes and characters. This is a strong soldier, strong young man. Wartime rhetoric mixed with years of agricultural success in the eyes of the British press transformed the stereotype of a weak or feminine Jew as shopping young men farmers, or during the war, soldiers. Jaffa during the occupation was the city that escaped the horrors of the war, if you ignore the mass deportations. The Yorkshire wrote of it on the 22nd of November 1917, a few days after the British took the port. The town is quite intact, and although it is customary state of Oriental filthiness, the usual odors are more or less overcome by the scent of the orange plantations, which perfume the air for miles around. In a short piece around the same time, the Birmingham Daily Post referred to Jaffa as the town of oranges, and famous for its oranges and other fruits, and the district abounds in orchards. And while no mention of the contemporary Arab population was made, a brief history of British and French occupation was, as well as the mention of a colony of Russian Jews. The following year, The Guardian in 1918 removed the Arab population almost completely from the imagery of Jaffa, focusing instead on the Jewish effort and their capacity to restore the land to its fitting place in civilization. This, of course, included their agricultural efforts, and the author speaks of making their way through orange groves and of villages celebrated in rabbinical lore. The British introduced cleanliness and order, and the most prominent avenue in Jaffa was the work of a Jewish engineer and contractor, and was apparently prompted by a desire to emulate the boulevards of Jewish suburbs of Tel Aviv. It concludes that during the last 20 years, the Jews have opened a new era in the history of Palestine, using the words to describe Zionist innovation as light and revival, while the rest of Palestine remained in semi-darkness. The end of the war meant almost assured British control of the area. With the Balfour Declaration having been given only the year before, tension was beginning to run high in Palestine. The Arab population began to protest openly. Leaflets were distributed calling for Arabs to resist Zionist influence on the area. Memoirs and letters from the time show us that the members of the British military administration shared the views of the dissenting members of the Arab population. And one Jewish observer in Palestine noted that the feelings between the Jews and the British are worse than ever. It is said by otherwise intelligent British people here in Palestine that the newspapers at home are entirely controlled by Jews and only express Jewish viewpoints. The idea that all newspapers were under Zionist influence is just as blatantly untrue as saying they were uniformly against Zionism. History, media, and people are so rarely black and white. In 1921, a few months after the Jaffa riots, the Scotsman ran an article entitled "Palestine, Arab Protest Against Zionist Aggression," which for the most part quoted from a statement issued by the Palestine Arab delegation. This statement is interesting in that it differentiated Zionism from Judaism in a way that the British press often didn't. It criticized Zionism specifically, claiming they had come into this country with the idea of dominating the Arab and became his master. Later, it held the Arab press as muzzled, and that the patriotic Arabs are arrested and imprisoned in pretext that they are dangerous to the state. And it is more popularly criticized that the government was changing the laws of the land, the ownership of the land, to the advantage of Zionist organizations and to the disadvantage of Arab farmers. It is difficult to completely ignore these claims. As often happens in more Zionist circles, similar criticisms were offered in other parts of the empire, including India, where there was censorship in place, and the entire structure of the land ownership was reshaped to fit British needs. But this piece is also an example of the types of articles that began to emerge as an imposing viewpoint to the prosperous Zionist colonists. As the mandate began to be formed, and certainly throughout the mandate itself, criticism against Zionism, sometimes like this one with the Arab population in mind, began to appear more regularly. These criticisms do not indicate a decline in positive news stories about the Zionist agriculture. In 1920, The Graphic, a weekly London newspaper known as one of the Great Eight, whose subscribers stretched the length of the British Empire and the US, and whose illustrators and writers we would still recognize today, ran an article entitled Jewish Progress in Palestine. It highlighted Zionist agriculture in the land of their forefathers, giving special attention to Tel Aviv, a Jewish garden city, and orange cultivation, comparing the up-to-date scientific methods of the Zionist agriculturalists to those of the Arab farmers, who sow in much the same primitive way as did their patriarchs of old. It speaks of the consequences of Turkish corruption and inefficiency in Zionist settlements before the war, and of British encouragement of the Zionist venture. If we merely take the oranges and wines exported by Jewish settlements, it concludes, we shall find that they alone represent nearly 25% of the exports. In a small bit on oranges, intriguingly titled The Juicy Jew, which I haven't decided if I like or not, the West Sussex Gazette claimed that Jaffa oranges were becoming more plentiful since the Jews have been getting back to Palestine. For while the Arab is a duffing cultivator, the Jew is a very painstaking one, and is adding much to the output. It is also important to note that the dominant Jewish voice presented in the media at this time was a Zionist one. In opinions or letters to the editors, or lectures covered, Zionist Jews received a disproportionate amount of coverage, even though they remained a minority until the 1930s. In one letter to the editor of the Yorkshire Post, the letter writer responds to a distinctly anti-Zionist and, quite frankly, anti-Semitic lecture given by Lord Sydenham, who's asking, who planted the vineyards and the orange groves, etc., in Rishon LeZion, Petah Tikva, and other numerous places in Palestine? If not the Jewish pioneers, then who? In 1922, the Exeter and Plymouth Gazette covered a lecture by Samuel Landon, General Secretary of the Zionist organization, in which he said that in spite of present difficulties, he had no doubt that the Arab population would settle down quietly in the next year or two, and together with the Jews, work for a prosperous and peaceful Palestine. That Jewish and Arab orange growers had combined for trading purposes, and that oranges, olives, grapes, watermelons, and almonds were all exported to the benefit of the British. He also claimed that Jewish and German colonists in Palestine got better yields than the Arabs because they farmed more scientifically. And that takes us to 1923, but I want to leave you on this piece from 1923 by Rubin. It's called First Fruits. And it does a very good job of describing not just what the British press thought of Palestine at the time, but also what emerging Zionist artists thought of themselves and of the land. In this bit here, you have a Jewish family from Yemen. They're considered the more traditional Jews. And they're holding a pomegranate, which is one of the more traditional fruits. Over here, you have the new European Jews, the Zionist settlers who are coming to the land. And with them, you have the newer fruits, such as a watermelon, banana, and oranges. So that's kind of the distinction between the two Jews. But on either side, you also have more landscape photos. Within that landscape are the Arab population, and they fit quite well into the background in these two pieces. Rubin was heavily influenced by Christian tradition. He was also very heavily influenced by the emerging Zionist rhetoric. So yeah, just want to leave you on that. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.